Welcome to Fox Tales Folklore, where we explore new stories and tell old tales. We are building a community through the ancient art of storytelling. We share our stories, and we hope to inspire you to stand up, sing out, to find your voice. Our stories shape our world. Your story can change the world. Join the chorus and fall in love with the world again and all of its possibilities. This week's episode, we celebrate the rivers that flow through the heartlands of America. Come along for a journey. This first story is one of the first stories I wrote when I began working for the Spirit of Peoria riverboat. It's based on the journals of an old woman who lived in the 1880s. And I quote a small piece from Mark Twain's Life on the River and stitch it together with a song by my good friend Jim Post, Steamboat Comin'. Steamboat comin', steamboat comin', steamboat comin', black smoke fills the sky. Doors swing open, the works come a-running, steamboat coming to town. Boys come whooping and the dogs come a-barking, steamboat coming to town. Horses in car trundle over cobblestone, steamboat coming to town. Lazy loafer, hurry, run along, steamboat coming to town. She's long and slim, sleek and pretty, sailing down the river just like a cloud. Fire in a smokestack lights up the sky. She's so loud, all the babies cry. Steamboat comin', steamboat comin', steamboat comin', black smoke fills the sky. That's a song I will never get tired of. I grew up here on the banks of the Illinois River. And I remember when I was a child, when the steamboat would come to town, why, even before you saw the boat come round the bend, the captain, he knew this river like the back of his hand. He knew it was coming up on a town. He'd give a shout down through the brass tube to the boiler, and one of the roustabouts would butter a few logs, meaning they smeared him with some black tar, so it'd burn a little blacker, and that black smoke was like a flag. You could see it before you saw the boat come round the bend. And maybe you'd give a shout to the calliope, and they'd fire up one of them old songs. You know the kind of song I'm talking about? The kind of song that makes you want to sing out. The kind of song that makes you want to dance or shed a tear like She's Forever Blowing Bubbles. And you'd hear that song wafted on the wind a mile or more away. You'd see that black smoke before you saw the boat come round the bend, and a shout would come up from the wharf. Steamboat comin', steamboat comin', steamboat comin', black smoke fills the sky. And whatever you were doing, everybody ran down to the wharf. Why, even the preacher, he learned the hard way. One time in the middle of a love fest, in the middle of a wedding, just as the groom is about to say I do, that shout come up, the church emptied out and had to finish the wedding down on the wharf. Or maybe it was a groom getting cold feet. But the bride, she caught him and made him say his I do's. When that shout come up, everybody went down to the river except the sheriff. He'd open shop. Because these roustabouts, these big burly men, they love to drink and fight and cuss, and seemed like every time Steamboat came to town, somebody would end up in the slammer and have to sleep it off. Oh, and the shopkeepers, they would open shop. Because these packet boats, they'd carry 100 or 200 passengers from St. Louis or Peoria or maybe all the way from New Orleans. And these passengers would come into town and they would go shopping, and those businesses would do more business in an afternoon than they would the rest of the week. And these tourists would be like, look here, this is probably made right here in Henry, Illinois. Little they know the last steamboat brought those goods to town. Tourism is nothing new. And how have you been on board on them old boats? They often had crystal chandeliers, Persian carpets. They had an upright bass or banjo or piano. And sometimes the band would tumble out in the street, and the whole town of Henry, Illinois would be dancing in the street. It was like the 4th of July and New Year's Eve all rolled in together. Sleepy little town of Henry, Illinois. Never saw so much excitement. But you better stay out of the way of them roustabouts. These big burly men would load and unload 2 tons of freight in a matter of moments. First, they would unload all the things that the shopkeepers had ordered. And then horses and carts rumbling over cobblestone with barrels of potatoes, barrels of wheat, hogs still on the hoof. Of course, you take your pork to market while the pigs are still alive. The pigs are fresher that way. And the captain, he always gave him a fair price. Knowing whatever he paid, he'd get twice as much when he got to market. And who knows? Apples grown right here in Illinois. Sold to one of them steamboat captains, could sail down the Illinois, down the Mississippi to New Orleans, be loaded on one of them ocean-going boats, and sail across the Atlantic. And who knows, an apple grown right here in Illinois could be served on a king's table in Paris or London. These river boats were our connection to the world. But when that first bell rang, that was a warning. It meant the roustabouts were done with their work. And townsfolk, we should get off, and tourists should get back on. Because when that second bell rang, that meant the boat was gone. And it seemed like every time that second bell rang, some townsfolk could still be on board the boat. They'd go running out the stage, sploosh, into the muddy river. And it seemed like every time that second bell rang, there'd still be some tourists in town, and the boat would be gone. They'd have to pay one of us to row them back out. Seemed like I could always earn a few pennies, and that's back when a few pennies counted for something. But when that steamboat left, the whole town would be standing on the wharf, waving and smiling. Our hearts a little richer, our pockets a little thicker. Why, even when the people are tiny little ants off in the distance, we're still waving and smiling. For it felt as though when that steamboat left, sleepy little town of Henry, Illinois would roll over and pull up the blankets. Now, some folks say it was a long time ago. Some folks say maybe it never really happened. Maybe it's all just some nostalgic dream. But I know it was real because I was there. And rumor has it, some of these steamboats are making a comeback. While the Belle of Louisville still sails the Ohio, the Delta Queen might be back on the water soon. And you know and I know the Spirit of Peoria still sails the Illinois. So maybe sometime you'll head down to the wharf. Maybe one of you will be the one who sees that black smoke. Maybe one of you will be the one who hears that shout. Steamboat coming, steamboat coming, steamboat coming, black smoke fills the sky. Captain is as calm as a kitten sleeping, steamboat coming to town. Everybody else is running or leaping, steamboat coming to town. Load and unload 2 tons of freight, steamboat coming to town. Roustabout driven by a cussing mate, steamboat coming to town. She's long and slim, sleek and pretty, sailing down the river just like a cloud. Fire in a smokestack, lights up the sky, she's so loud all the babies cry. Steamboat coming, steamboat coming, steamboat coming, black smoke fills the sky. Thank you. Now, if you travel to Starved Rock on the Spirit of Peoria riverboat, the folks at the park will tell you that this is a legend. But I've done my homework, and I can document the evidence to tell you the true story of Starved Rock. This next story, I believe, is a true story. Now, if you go to Starved Rock, and have you been to Starved Rock? They call it the Legend of Starved Rock. Now, as a folklorist, I know the word legend means it may be partially true and may be exaggerated over time. But I've done a lot of research, and I do believe this is the true story. And in the end, you'll hear the proof. In the time before time, the Illiniwek, which means the brave men or the real men, they lived from the shores of Lac Michigamme, Lake Michigan, to the great father of waters, the Mississippi. They farmed in the fertile alluvial fill along the river shore. They hunted the great herds of tatanka, the buffalo, and elk, wapiti. In the time before time, the people lived plentiful. But as more and more Europeans came to the Atlantic coast, the tribes of the east were forced to the west. And tribes that once lived together harmoniously, forced into each other's territory, became warring nations. Now, Chief Pontiac, you know Pontiac, the man the car was named after. He was born at Fort Detroit. You know Detroit. I think you say Detroit. Do you know who built Detroit? A Frenchman by the name of Cadillac. And they both drove Mitsubishis. You might want to cut that out. Pontiac and Cadillac were actually good friends. In the French and Indian Wars, who were the French really fighting? The British. The wars of Europe followed them to the New World, and both sides hired Indians as mercenaries to attack their enemy. When the French lost,
to the British, the French abandoned their allies, and Pontiac was outraged. How could he be so disrespected? So Pontiac was the first in the Great Lakes to try to organize all the tribes that once fought against each other to join forces and push the white man back into the sea from whence he had come. Pontiac's rebellion failed. And so Pontiac went to St. Louis across the Mississippi to negotiate the treaties. And he gave away land that did not belong to him. He gave away land that belonged to his enemy, the Illinois, because the Illini did not join the Confederacy. In the treaty negotiations, Pontiac argued fiercely for his friends and allies, but gave away land that was not his. In that meeting was a young Illinois who was outraged. After the treaties were signed, he made sure that the bodyguards of Pontiac were liquored up. And when the guards were down, this young Illini put a knife between the ribs of Chief Pontiac and left him bleeding in the streets of St. Louis. Now the friends of Pontiac were outraged, and they chased this young man across the Mississippi River into Illinois. They tracked him for several days. They caught him hiding in a tree, inside a hollow tree, and he met a fate worse than death. And then the friends of Pontiac, outraged, they decided to attack his village across the Illinois River from the rock. Now at this point, the Kaskaskia band of the Illinois, once a mighty race, had been greatly diminished in these wars. And most of them had left. There was once a village, I say village, there was once a huge city of 10,000 people living across from the rock. That would make it nearly as large as Paris or London. This was not a village. But when the French pulled out, most of the Indians followed them and moved to southern Illinois. So when the Sauk, the Fox, the Potawatomi, the Kickapoo, the Ottawa banded together to attack the Illini, it was a very small village. And when they saw their enemy amassed against them, what would you do? Fight or flight? Their first thought was, let's jump into our canoes and let's paddle downstream to Peoria. Our friends, the Peoria village, they will help us and maybe we can defeat our enemy. But if they were caught on the river in a non-defensible position, they would be slaughtered. So plan B, if you will, they decided to hide on top of the rock. They decided to hide on top of the rock and send a couple of canoes south as a little bit of a decoy to distract their enemy. And then the canoes would race ahead and they would warn the Peoria, and maybe the Peoria would come north. And they would follow them south, surround and conquer them. But the Sauk, the Fox, the Potawatomi, the Ottawa, the Kickapoo, they had scouts out ahead of their troops. They did not fall for the decoy. They saw that most of the village went to the top of the rock. Now, if you've ever climbed that rock, you know there's only one way up, which makes it a great place to build a fort. And that's why the French built the first St. Louis on top of the rock. But because there's only one way up, it also means there's only one way down. So it's easy for the enemy to lay in siege, to surround the rock and starve them out. And that's exactly what they did. On the top of the rock, they could look across the river. They could see their cornfields ripening in the late summer sun, but they soon ran out of food. Now, you could live without food for several days. Some of us, maybe a week or more. But without water? Even though the river was directly below them, if they tried to lower a bucket or a gourd, the gourd would be smashed, the rope would be cut. Without water? Maybe a few days at the most. It wasn't long before buzzards began to gather in great numbers at the foul stench of death. Their enemy just waited them out. When they met no resistance, they charged to the top of the rock, and they actually found one young man clinging to the last threads of life. They rescued him. They brought him food and water so he could live to tell the tale, to instill fear in the hearts of their enemy. This young Illinois, he moved downriver to Peoria, where he had cousins among the Peoria tribe. And when the French settlement grew. He actually married a French girl, and he took a French name, Antoine Lebel. And when Peoria became an American city, a reporter found this old Indian and interviewed him, the last survivor, the only survivor of Starved Rock. And that's how I know this story is true. But they say, still to this day, if you go to the top of the rock late at night when the moon is full and the wind is whispering in the oak leaves, you'll hear the moaning and groaning of those who starved upon the rock. Starved Rock. Thank you.
Our next storyteller is a young woman named McKinley, and she's telling one of my favorite true stories about an amazing catfish here in the Illinois River.
This story is a true story. I know it is true because it happened to a friend of mine. He grew up in Peoria, Illinois, right on the banks of the Illinois River. His favorite thing to do when he was a boy was going fishing. When he was with his dad in the boat and they were just rowing around, whether or not they caught anything, he was in heaven. His dad would be telling him jokes and stories. I tell you, he was in heaven. He loved to go fishing with his dad, and he still does. He'll never forget this one day. He and his dad were out rowing on the river. As they were rowing around, his dad put a little squiggly worm on his hook. He had his big lead sinker and his trusty Zebco 202. He was catfishing. He looked around and thought, where are those catfish hiding? He cast his line, zzz, splash. It landed right where he wanted it. Wouldn't you know it, no sooner had it hit the water when this V started moving over towards the boat. He waited until he felt a little nibble. And then he waited until it felt like a tug. He knew not to pull too fast or too hard. And when he felt that tug, he set his line and he reeled it in next to the boat. Whoa, did it fight. It was pulling to the left and pulling to the right. He got that catfish up next to the boat and he said, Dad, get the net ready. It's a big one. His dad said, we don't have a net, son. He got it up next to the boat. He knew if he tried to pick it up, the line might break. So his dad reached in, got his fingers underneath the gills and pulled it onto the boat. Shooey, he said, that's one of the biggest catfish I've ever seen. The world record for flathead catfish is 91 pounds. The Illinois record is 78 pounds. His catfish weighed 47.5 pounds. He was more than a couple pounds shy of the state record, but none could argue. This was a big fish. I did see a picture of the Illinois record, though. It was caught by a man who stood 6'3", and when he held it up by its shoulder, it's nearly dragged on the ground. The picture was so big that it weighed 5 pounds. In those days, they didn't have coolers with lots of ice. Do you remember those days? They had to wrap the fish up in wet newspaper to keep it moist and fresh. They wrapped it up and brought it home and put it on the back porch. My friend ran inside and yelled, Mom, look at this catfish I caught. Look at this catfish. His mom came running out onto the back porch and said, Shooey, that's one of the biggest catfish I've ever seen. My friend said, Mom, do you think we could eat it for supper tonight? Now, my friend's mom always enjoyed pulling his leg. That's why he walks a little lopsided. She said, My, that catfish is so big. We could eat it for supper and breakfast and lunch and supper and breakfast and lunch and supper and breakfast and lunch and supper and breakfast and lunch. He knew it was a big catfish, and the truth is, it could feed a family of 5 boys for several meals. They unwrapped the newspaper, and it looked kind of dead. His eyes were all bugged out. His lips were going glub, glub, glub. My friend said, Mom, Dad, look, he's still alive. We can't eat it if it's still alive, can we? You see, in those days, they'd never heard of sushi. My friend's dad said he was feeling kind of tired. It was late in the evening. He said, we'll just ice it down and leave it here on the back porch. We'll skin it up first thing in the morning and we'll eat it tomorrow. Now, my friend didn't like that idea, but his dad made the rules and he lived by them. He was the king. At least, his wife let him think he was. My friend went upstairs and went to bed, but he could not get any sleep. Do you know how it is the first day before summer vacation? It was like that. He was just so excited. He kept thinking about that catfish. I guess he eventually fell asleep because the next morning he woke up. And when he woke up, he slipped on his slippers and he ran out onto the back porch, but the catfish wasn't there. He looked around in the backyard and he found it in the grass. And it was looking kind of dead. His eyes were all bugged out. His lips were going glub, glub, glub. He said, Mom, Dad, come out here. He's still alive. His mom and dad ran out onto the back porch. His dad was still in his slippers with a cup of coffee. Maybe you were lucky enough to have a dad like my friend's dad. I could ask him the craziest questions and he'd still have an answer. Sometimes my friend thought he was making it up. My friend asked, "Dad, how come he's still alive?" His dad scratched his head and thought about it. He said, I guess there was just enough dew on the ground to keep him moist and keep him alive. My friend said, "So if he's still alive, can I keep him as a pet, please?" Now, my friend's dad did exactly what I'm sure you did. He laughed at my friend. He said, "That's the silliest thing I've ever heard. I've heard of people having a cat for a pet, and I've heard of people having a fish for a pet, but I've never heard of anybody having a catfish for a pet." My friend gave them his best puppy dog eyes, and they finally agreed. They could keep it for a couple of days. Now, with a catfish that big, where do you suppose they kept it? That's right, they kept it in the bathtub. They filled it up with water, a little hot, a little cold. My friend stuck his little elbow in to make sure it was just right. And he needed help from his dad to get the catfish in the tub. It was that big. And then they got it in there, and he looked so happy. Have you ever seen a catfish smile? Me either. I don't think they can, but if he could, he would have been smiling. He looked so happy. Now, it was a Saturday, and my friend did have chores to do. I don't remember exactly, but he was either raking the lawn or mowing the leaves. Anyway, when he finished his chores, he ran back upstairs to check on the catfish. And the bathtub was empty. When the catfish was swimming around, his fin got caught on the chain and yanked out the plug. All the water had gone, and the fish was looking kind of dead. His eyes were all bugged out. His lips were going glub, glub, glub. Now, I said that my friend's dad thought he was pretty smart. He still is, but he never fixed anything. That bathroom faucet had a drip, drip, drip. It gave that fish just enough water that he was able to get his nose under there and to keep him alive. My friend saw that and said, "Look, his gills are moving. He's learning to breathe air like a human being. Maybe if he can breathe air, I can teach him to do other things that people can do too." His dad just laughed and said, "Yeah, right, like what?" My friend said, "Well, maybe I can teach him how to walk." Now, you might laugh, but I'm not making this up. I read it in the encyclopedia, and it never lies. Have you ever heard of the walking catfish that lives in Africa? My friend said, if a catfish in Africa can walk, why can't a catfish in Illinois? They took it out of the bathtub and stood it up on his hind fins. He wobbled at first, but eventually he caught his balance and he started walking around the bathroom. My friend said, if I can get him to walk, maybe I can put him to work. He fired up the lawnmower, he leaned that catfish up against the lawnmower, and it helped him keep his balance, and he started mowing the lawn. Now, all the neighbors were staring. They couldn't believe their eyes. One neighbor, Miss Grzybowski, said, "If he can mow your lawn, do you think he could mow my lawn too?" Together, they made a lot of money that summer. They made $47.83. Now, that was back in a day when $47 was a lot of money. Now, most kids, they make money and their parents take it away from them, make them save for college. But have you ever heard of a catfish going to Harvard? He got to spend his money. They liked to go down to the Rio Theater and see the movies. He loved Flipper and Son of Flipper and Return of Flipper, anything with fish in them. Free Willy 3 was his favorite. He always had a big smile on his face, and he'd clap his little fins if he liked it. Now, I'm sure you think that this is a pretty funny story. I'll bet a few of you are smiling, but the truth is it's a tragedy. You see, one day my friend came home and his dad said, "Hey son, what do you say we take that catfish of yours fishing?" He said, "Daddy, don't talk about fishing in front of the FISH. He might think it's killing his relatives or something." The dad said, "No, his brain's about the size of a lima bean. He doesn't know what's going on. Truth is, he thinks he's a human now." Have you ever heard the saying, ignorance is bliss? He was pretty happy all the time. His dad already had all of the poles set up. They brought him out onto the boat on the Illinois River. They were rowing around. The catfish had trouble casting out. He had never been on this end of a fishing pole before. My friend helped him cast out, and wouldn't you know it, he got the first bite. But it was kind of hard to get the fish up, and he was kind of slimy. When he was trying to get the fish onto the boat, he lost his balance, fell into the river, and drowned.
Well, I've been floating down this river 7 years and fourscore. I've seen a lot of changes. I hope to see some more. Chicago sewer is my river, a river of my dirty dreams. Industrial pollution, a nightmare's what I mean. Imagine swimming in a soup so dark and murky black. a soup of chemicals and poop, and oxygen it lacks, 'cause I'm a catfish, catfish, singing the catfish blues. I'm a catfish, catfish, bringing you the news. Well, you don't know the trouble till you know the trouble I'm in. My brother caught a hook in the face and someone took his skin. I'm a catfish, singing the catfish blues. I'm a catfish, I'm bringing you the news. I'm a catfish.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Foxtails Folklore. Next time, invite your friends. And maybe you can send us a link to you telling one of your favorite folk tales, and we'll use it on an upcoming episode. Join our choir to fall in love with the world and all of its possibilities.